So I tried to make this video a couple of times, so I'm hoping that this time it'll turn out the way I'm hoping it will turn out, because I am really tired of trying to discuss or explain this topic. So here's hoping. So me and a lot of people like me grew up with strict parents, and I guess whether or not they realize it, their strictness tends to come with unintended consequences. Now, when I talk about strict parenting, I don't necessarily mean parents who set like certain boundaries, reasonable boundaries that you're just pissed off at, because that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like parenting that affects your child in a negative way, right? So, like not allowing your child to socialize, which tends to stunt them as an adult. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Now, I grew up with this kind of parenting, and it sucks. It really sucks. And one of the things that I was restricted in when I was a kid was dating. Now, I don't like talking too much about my personal life. I like to keep like a certain level of privacy. I'll keep certain things to myself, but I feel like in this case, with this thing that I'm talking about, I'm gonna have to get a little personal with you, but I'm still gonna keep things vague enough so that, I still have that level of privacy, for myself. So yeah, basically, the entirety of my childhood, I was very much restricted from things like dating, socializing, going out, whatever. Right? Now, I know what you're thinking, that these things are reasonable, and to a certain extent, it is reasonable. Like, certain things obviously you can't just allow your child to do. I understand that, of course, but there are certain times when you should and shouldn't do something. So I might be fine for you to tell your child not to go out with certain groups of people, because they might lead them in harm's way. There are also times when you should be willing to allow your child to socialize with people their age, so that they're able to develop within society. Now, I did not grow up with reasonable parents in this case. I grew up with parents who very much were against socializing. If I was allowed to socialize, it was going to be under some kind of supervision, which makes things awkward, of course. And it definitely did not lead to me developing any sort of meaningful relationships as a child. Not that I couldn't, but that was a lot harder to do so under that kind of supervision. And I'm not the only one. There are plenty of people who grow up with these kinds of things. As I mentioned before, one of the things I was restricted in was dating. If you're like, a melanated person as I am, specifically an Asian or an Indian person, you definitely heard the no dating talks from your parents, which is, typical, I think, for a lot of people like us. I'm not going to get too specific into what my parents told me, but let's just say that they were very extreme with the messaging, and leave it there. Alright? They're very extreme with the messaging, and they made it very clear, no dating whatsoever. Now, I'm not going to get too in depth with how my dating life went as a child and going into an adult, but let's just say it was difficult, and that obviously those rules caused a lot of problems for me. Fast forward a few years, I'm 18, and suddenly I'm starting to get these, I guess, just these questions, I guess, about my dating life. First time I heard these questions when I just graduated high school, and one of my aunts had mentioned something about me getting a girlfriend or whatever, and it was a little weird, but I brushed it off just because she was like somebody that was like super close, so I was just like whatever. And then I want to say not long after, another one of my aunts who was much closer brought it up, and she's brought it up a few times, which is strange, much stranger to me. And it was weird because one time she mentioned some girl that worked at this library that she goes to, who also happens to be white, and if you know all the rules of the older generation, race mixing or whatever, not allowed. So that was wild, to say the least. Then when I was 19, my dad had a talk with me about getting married at 25, about how I should get married at 25, which is wild because, like I said, my parents are both very extreme with the messaging on no dating. So, yeah, I was bamboozled, flustered, flabbergasted, shocked, whatever other words you can think of. And now my mother, she brings up now the whole thing about, when you get about grandkids or whatever. And I've told her many times I'm not doing that. I'm completely checked out of the idea of dating and marriage and kids and all that. I'm not interested. And I guess she doesn't believe me because, she once mentioned that I'd probably have the most kids out of all of her children, and I rebuked that. I rebuked that evil shit in my life. So yeah, but basically that's how it's been for me, with the questions from family members about my dating life. So yeah, very uncomfortable. Very much don't want to deal with the hypocrisy. And yeah, I'm not sure if it's because of how how people around me suggested dating, or if it's because of my own personal beliefs, but I'm not interested at all in dating or marriage or kids or anything like that. So I guess that's something that, I don't know, I guess we'll see or figure out in the foreseeable future. But I feel like I'm not the only one. I see a lot of videos and posts online, which maybe is not the best way to look at it, of people like me who are also uninterested in dating. I also have siblings. I don't want to talk too much about them because they're underage. So, or at least two of them are underage. The others are not. But I know at the very least one of them is also uninterested in dating, and I'm pretty sure she had the same talk that I got. Which is funny because I think she used to be into the idea of having a family, but now I think she's just completely uninterested. I think almost bothered at the idea of people suggesting otherwise. So, yeah, but I don't want to talk too much about them because, they're not old enough to really be thinking about those kinds of things right now. But I know at the very least that there are people online who also, I think, have at least some sort of similar experience. And I was starting to ask myself the question if the kind of strict parenting that we receive when we're younger tends to affect our willingness to date and get married and have kids as we get older. I kind of want to lean towards yes, but at the same time, I also don't feel like I know enough to say for sure. I feel like that you need like a sample study, like like a scientific experiment to prove that the strict parenting leads to the sort of thing that that leads to people not wanting to get into relationships and whatnot. But me personally, I think it's true. I think the amount of strict parenting that takes place over a child's life will tend to usually lead them to not want to have kids, especially in this day and age. I know back then that sort of thing didn't happen, but I think that the difference is that back then there was more of a societal pressure to have a family, whereas nowadays I think that pressure has been alleviated. So it's more based on self than it is on the group as a whole. I think that nowadays, I think that even though the economic standards and the social relationships that people have that are decaying now, while they are a factor within the decline of, I guess, people. I mean, just look at South Korea, for example. I also feel like there is like an under discussed point of like the people who raised us and what they were telling us about dating and what the things that we were seeing of how relationships worked out and how that might have also affected us as we got older. I think when it comes at least to the aspect of the parenting and how it affects us as kids, that the more restrictive that the parents were, and again this is just a guess, but the more restricted the parents were when it came to things like socializing and dating and building relationships, the less likely it was for the child to have a family of their own. Some of you might disagree with that, and that's fine. But I personally don't feel like I don't think I'm wrong. I just can't prove it. I just can't prove that that strict parenting leads to the decline of families and whatnot. But I do think that there is some merit to my idea, because I think with the decline of socialization, there is definitely a more of a need for a person to isolate themselves from society, and therefore, they tend to be more lonely and uninterested in forming a family of any kind. One of the things that I thought about too when I was thinking of the topic of this video was what I thought was the plan for these kinds of like strict parents and what they thought was going to happen, because I'm always kind of fascinated by people who make like these kind of grand strict plans and how they expect these things to just turn out exactly the way they wanted, even though I'm sure they've tried to do so in the past with their own lives, and of course things didn't work out. I'm not sure if there's a case of, or some sort of thing where we could say maybe they're trying to live vicariously through their kids in some way, or if it's just some delusion that they have. But I feel like that tends to be the case. But anyway, I always felt that the strict parents in this case tended to have like a very rigid idea of what their child's life would turn out like, and that's why they had all these like plans, these ridiculous plans that they would just expect the child to go along with. There was this quote, I think I got it from The Punisher, of all things. And the quote was that if you wanted to make God laugh, you should just show him your plans. I'm paraphrasing that, I think, but that's basically what it was. If you want to make God laugh, show him your plans. And I like that quote a lot, actually. I think it's a good quote, and I think it pretty much exposes, I guess, the thinking of a lot of people, especially these kind of these strict parents, where it's like, they come up with all these plans, and somehow it never ends up the way they want it to. Or even if it does end up the way they want it to, I think they tend to end up just not being involved. Because, of course, a lot of people cut off their parents, too, and just don't want them involved in their life, whatever. In some ways, I think I'm kind of interested in not having a family because I want to see, like, what happens. I've heard or seen sketches or stories where the parent gets more concerned about their child's non-existent dating life, and I guess loosens up a bit to allow them, or give or perceive some perceived amount of autonomy over their lives, so that they can have grandkids. And so I feel like a part of my uninterest in dating is just waiting it out and seeing what happens to them as they get older. I'm just fascinated by it now at this point. I just want to see what happens. But there is but it's still like a gym. Like I don't want to have like any family whatsoever. I just want to see how they react to it. You know what I mean? I didn't expect my father to suddenly have a sudden interest in me having a family at 25, despite his insistence that I not date at all. So, yeah, now I just want to see how this turns out. Like, I'm just so fascinated by it now. I'm just fascinated by what's going to happen when I turn 30, and if I make it to 30, and they get old, because my parents are already old, so they probably won't live long enough to even see their grandkids if any of us manage to pull it off. Something I heard from a friend of mine from a long time ago was that her parents are also very strict. Her mother would tell her that she should just like sneak out and meet with boys or whatever, and my friend was very much confused about how she was supposed to do that because her parents wouldn't let her leave the house. So I guess there's also that other thing that I wanted to mention is that, like, maybe I'm stretching here, but I feel like on some level, I guess maybe at least for some parents, what the hell is that? I guess maybe for like some of these parents, I guess they expect their child to rebel and go out and do these things anyway. I'm not sure if that's true, but it seems like that tends to happen, because like you hear all those stories about, especially with Asians, their parents just doing a 180 and suddenly expecting their kids to be married with kids at some point, despite not allowing them to make any attempt to do so previously. It's very much like hold on. It's like I guess stunting them or shirking them or like blocking any opportunity for them to do so previously in their lives. And so I wonder basically if they kind of just like wanted or expected us to just like go behind their backs secretly anyway. I'm not really sure if that tends to be the case, if that's true, but I'm just speculating that maybe that's what some of those kinds of parents expected. Of course, that backfired tremendously, especially now because COVID and the decay of society with all these wars and the economy and all that shit. So yeah. Like I said, if you want to make God laugh, show me your plans. I really like that quote. It's such a good quote. Somebody should put down a T-shirt or something. But yeah, I feel like those kinds of parents shot themselves in the foot because now they're definitely not going to have grandkids, and they're probably going to go through it in the worst way possible now. I mean, South Korea is basically going extinct. If we're being honest, like they're not going to be here much longer if they don't get their shit together. Of course, that's not the fault of the young people there. That's the fault of the older generations not creating a sustainable environment for the youth, the Korean youth to have a family in livable conditions. God damn, I'm slow. But I think that when it comes down to it, I feel like a lot of these parents and the way that they tended to raise their kids was based completely in contradictions, and now they're kind of like, or usually end up at a point where they're like completely fucked, like whatever they told their kid to do, their kid listened and took it to the extreme. Because remember what I said, the strict parents, they do things in extremes. They tell you not to do something, and they make it extremely clear not to do so. And there's never like a limit to when, like they don't say, don't date until you're like 18 or whatever. They just say don't date and leave it at that, and they'll make an extreme point of it. And so I guess it sticks into your mind, because remember, kids are very impressionable. They're very much I guess fallible to these kinds of things, and if you imprint it on them long enough, eventually it'll just sink in and remain that you just don't do that. And it's, I guess, just hard to break as you get older, because as you get older, certain habits tend to just stick with you. And so I can't really imagine that most people who grew up like that tend to ever break those kinds of habits as they get older. And so, like I said, they shot themselves in the foot. They ain't getting no grandkids now. None of these kinds of parents are usually ever getting grandkids. And if they do, they're not going to see them, basically. I feel like a very small proportion of those strict parents will ever get to pull it off somehow. So, yeah, I think there's not really any like outro for this. I guess I just wanted to talk about it because it's just like a topic that fascinates me, and I feel like not enough people talk about or even like have ever thought about something like that. And I kind of wish they would, because I mean they do, but like I don't like more than like just as a joke, but like more so like taking it seriously, especially amongst like Asians and Indians, because we hear this shit a lot growing up. And so I think it's an important topic to discuss because of how it affects us as time goes on. And I think even though it's like a joke amongst us, like I feel like somebody should like discuss it more seriously, because I think it would just be like an interesting topic to speak about, especially for people who are more intelligent and more well versed in these kinds of topics than I am. So yeah, I guess basically get the ball rolling, comment, subscribe, like the video, and all that good stuff, because I think it's a really interesting topic that we could discuss, especially nowadays in 2026. Like we really should like discuss like how these things are affecting us overall. But yeah, it's basically all I'm gonna say, so I'll just leave it there. See ya.